Let's unravel the story. The story begins with a young woman named Sawyer Scott, who enjoys staying active and working out in her free time. One day, she receives an exciting call. She's been invited for a job interview in Washington. Overwhelmed with joy and disbelief, she quickly returns to her dorm to prepare for the trip. The next day, Scott embarks on a long journey to Washington, hoping for a fresh start and a better life. However, midway through her trip, she encounters heavy traffic. To save time, she decides to take an alternate route using Google Maps. After driving deep into the detour, Google Maps suddenly instructs her to turn right. To her frustration, the road ahead is marked as closed. Annoyed, she realizes the navigation app has led her the wrong way. Thinking it's an error, she turns the car around only for the app to misdirect her again. As she tries to find her way, two mysterious figures begin watching and following her. While checking a physical map, a pickup truck suddenly pulls up beside her. The men in the truck introduce themselves as Hollister and his brother Buck, claiming to be locals willing to help. Though suspicious, Scott politely declines their offer. However, her unease grows when Hollister insists she come to his house for a drink, making it clear he won't take no for an answer. Without warning, Hollister touches Scott, triggering her anger. A fight breaks out, but thanks to her athleticism, Scott proves tougher than they expected. Despite an injured leg, she manages to fight back, leaving both men momentarily incapacitated. With no other choice, she runs deep into the woods to escape. In the forest, Scott quickly ties her jacket around her wounded leg to stop the bleeding. As night falls, exhausted and in pain, she searches for shelter. Determined to survive, she reassures herself that everything will be okay. Finally, she finds a rocky area where she curls up to protect herself from the freezing cold. The next morning, a police officer named Nick receives a call about an abandoned car near Rust Creek. He reports it to his superior, Sheriff James O'Doyle, who decides to handle the case himself while assigning Nick to other duties. When O'Doyle arrives at the scene, he notices dried blood outside the car, making him even more suspicious. Meanwhile, Scott is awakened by the sound of a passing helicopter. Struggling with her injured leg, she desperately waves for help, but the aircraft flies on, oblivious to her cries. Back in town, O'Doyle smirks as he sees Hollister with a bandaged face. Knowing Hollister's criminal past, he questions him about the abandoned car, but Hollister feigns ignorance. When Buck arrives, O'Doyle becomes even more suspicious, noticing their injuries. Hollister brushes it off, claiming they got hurt while hunting in the woods. Lacking concrete evidence, O'Doyle leaves, but he isn't convinced. Meanwhile, Scott fights through excruciating pain as her leg wound begins to show signs of infection. Feverish and weak, she struggles to stay conscious. Despite her worsening condition, her strong will keeps her going, refusing to give up hope for survival. Hollis and Buck arrived at Scott's car to get rid of any evidence. Meanwhile, Scott, feeling feverish, checked his wound. Seeing it was getting worse and starting to rot, he could only hope for a miracle. Suddenly, he heard voices from the top of the cliff. His heart sank when he saw the two troublemakers tossing his car, his parents' gift, over the edge. Hollis, excited, rushed over to check the wreckage. Remembering that Scott was still missing, Hollis urged Buck to continue searching. As they walked away, Scott desperately searched for his phone, which he had left in the car. Even though the screen was cracked, he was relieved it still turned on. However, he became frustrated upon realizing there was no signal. At that moment, Hollis stumbled upon a blood-stained bandage. Convinced Scott was nearby, he pushed Buck to search more thoroughly. Meanwhile, Scott, weak and exhausted from walking in search of a signal, suddenly realized his phone's battery was about to die. Feeling utterly drained, he finally broke down in tears. As night fell, he stumbled upon a small cabin and, unable to go any further, collapsed unconscious. The next morning, Scott woke up in an unfamiliar room with his wounds already treated. He tried to get up but winced in pain. His body was in terrible shape. A mysterious man entered, causing Scott to panic. He frantically searched for a weapon, but before he could act, the man, introducing himself as Louis, tried to calm him down. What exactly had Scott been treated with? Meanwhile, Nick grew suspicious and questioned why Hollis and Buck had visited the police station. He was convinced they were hiding something. Despite noticing some inconsistencies in their story, James dismissed the situation as a misunderstanding. He claimed that the car's owner had simply run out of gas and had already retrieved it. Still unconvinced, Nick decided to investigate on his own. The next morning, Louis brought Scott some food, but Scott panicked when he realized his hands were tied. Seeing him struggle, Louis urged him to eat. Though starving, Scott initially refused. But as soon as Louis was distracted, his hunger took over, and he quickly devoured the food. After eating, Scott recounted the attack he had endured. 3 days earlier, while following directions on Google Maps, he was suddenly ambushed by 2 men who tried to assault him. Luckily, he managed to fight back and escape. Upon hearing this, Louis seemed to recognize the attackers. Louis immediately signaled Scott to stay quiet, because the very men Scott described were right outside the caravan. Hollis and Buck were actually Louis's cousins. Without hesitation, Hollis announced that they were searching for a woman who had escaped into the woods. Unlike his cousins, Louis wanted to protect Scott. He played dumb, pretending he had no idea what they were talking about. Inside the caravan, Scott, now panicked, struggled to untie himself. Sensing something was off, Hollis ordered Buck to check inside. Louis tensed up. Scott was still tied up in there. But just in time, Scott managed to free himself. Moments later, Scott tried to sneak away toward the cabin. But Louis, not wanting him to make a reckless move, urged him to wait for the right time to escape. They were deep in the woods, far from civilization. Hearing this, Scott, weak and in pain, reluctantly agreed. That night, Commander John arrived at the police station, demanding an update on the red car found in Rust Creek. James, caught off guard, stammered that the case was already closed. But just then, Nick revealed his findings. The car belonged to a woman named Scott, who had been missing for 4 days. Displeased with James's incompetence, John announced that he would send a search team and tracking officers to comb the forest. As soon as John left, James looked visibly nervous, like he was hiding something. Back at the caravan, Louis warned Scott to be careful with the alkaline powder he had used on his wound. It was highly corrosive and needed to be neutralized with milk as soon as possible. Scott, eager to leave, promised not to expose Louis's illegal drug-making operation. But Louis, fearing his cousins would catch Scott, urged him to be patient and wait for the right moment. He didn't even have a car to take Scott away. However, his cousins were planning a trip to the city over the weekend to sell drugs. That would be the perfect time to borrow a car and get Scott out of there. On the other side, James, who is frustrated, blames Hollis and Buck for their reckless actions. Scott's disappearance will likely lead to a massive search operation by the Central Police, which worries James because he fears they might discover his illegal drug lab. It turns out James has been running a drug business with the Hollis brothers. Hearing this, Hollis and Buck promise to try harder to find Scott. The next morning, Scott is seen helping Louis make drugs. Louis asks Scott to pour Asteron liquid into a bucket filled with matchstick wrappers. While carrying a flask of alkaline liquid, Louis explains that this liquid is even more dangerous than alkali powder. It only takes a small spark to trigger a massive explosion. When Hollis and Buck are about to arrive, Louis tells Scott to hide. But before leaving, Scott grabs a screwdriver just in case. Back at the police station, Nick arrives and is shocked when he overhears James talking on the phone about Scott. James then instructs Hollis to get rid of the girl once they find her. Realizing Nick has been listening, James panics and tries to convince him to join forces. However, Nick, being an honest cop, refuses to be part of this corruption. As tensions rise, Nick warns James to stay silent because the law will soon catch up to him. But as he reaches for his keys, they accidentally fall to the ground. Seizing the opportunity, James, the corrupt officer, mercilessly takes action against his own subordinate, determined to keep his crimes hidden. That night, James orders Hollis and Buck to bury Nick's body deep in the forest. He also takes Scott's wallet, which Hollis found, to perfect his sinister plan. The next day, when Commander John arrives, James immediately puts his plan into action. He pretends to be suspicious about Nick's sudden disappearance. Before John can start an investigation, James dramatically opens Nick's locker, planting false evidence to frame him for Scott's abduction. Once John believes his story, James quickly leaves the station as the search team prepares for action. Meanwhile, Louis and Scott are chatting outside the caravan. Louis admits he's tired of this life and dreams of working somewhere else. However, their moment is interrupted when Louis hears a car approaching. James is here to check on the production. Louis, holding his rifle, tells James to wait for the batch to be ready. Sensing something off, James confidently claims he can shoot Louis before he even aims. But Louis isn't aiming at James. He's targeting the chemical drums that could explode at any moment. He warns James to leave. Shortly after, Hollis arrives to pick up the package. But just before leaving, he notices fresh shoe prints on the stairs and realizes Louis has been hiding Scott all along. After Hollis and Buck leave, Louis rushes to Scott, planning their escape. However, before they can act, Louis is caught red-handed hiding Scott. In a state of panic, Louis secretly signals Scott and asks her to make coffee for Hollis and Buck. But instead of coffee, Scott pours the highly explosive alkaline liquid. Moments later, Buck notices something strange with the microwave, but it's too late. He gets trapped inside the caravan as it erupts into a massive explosion. Chaos ensues, but their relief turns to horror when they see that Hollis has survived. Louis quickly tells Scott to run as far as she can. With Hollis cornered, Louis tries to convince his brother to leave this illegal business, warning that James will betray them sooner or later. Suddenly, James arrives. Tragically, the kind-hearted Louis falls victim to James. Meanwhile, Scott, an experienced runner, dashes away at full speed. Realizing the mess he's in, James decides to pin everything on Hollis and his family, framing them as the main suspects in the drug operation. Feeling hopeless, Hollis can only accept his fate in regret. After running for a long time, Scott finally feels relieved when she encounters a police officer. But to her horror, it's James. Trying to keep his cover, James tells Scott to stay calm. However, during their conversation, Scott recognizes his voice. It's the same man behind the illegal drug operation. Scott's fear intensifies when James stops his car and leads her toward the riverbank. Realizing she's about to be executed, she desperately pleads for James to repent. But the corrupt cop shows no remorse. He pushes Scott into the river, hoping she'll pass out and drown. However, in a shocking twist, Scott stabs James straight in the heart with the screwdriver. He collapses into the river, carried away by the current. With an injured leg, Scott struggles to find her way back to the road. And just like that, the movie comes to an end. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.